Okay, in part one, I talked about the house itself. But in this video, I'm going to talk about our wild, expansive yard. So our backyard was this huge, wild field. There was a forest surrounding the property, and there was a creek that went through the forest. Now, some parts of the forest were deeper and thicker than others. And in the thickest parts, the trees were ancient and enormous. And there was a canopy overhead, making the forest floor almost like being indoors. They were great climbing trees. Some of them had paths worn into the bark from us walking up them because the trees were at an angle. And these trees were like buildings themselves. They were enormous, and we often thought of them as like rooms. So the forest was like having an additional house, and the trees were like rooms that we would go into because they were so big. Some of these trees, the huge ancient trees, were right up against the house. One of them had a tire swing. One of them had a tree house. In addition, we had a clubhouse that my dad had actually built with a door and windows and everything. The forest was amazing. We spent many happy hours in that forest. Now, the back field and just the yard in general was often very interesting. Because the property had belonged to so many people over the centuries, people had planted all kinds of things in often a bizarre combination. Because sometimes you'd have people who wouldn't know what the previous people had done. So, for example, in our back field, which when we lived there was kind of wild, it hadn't always been wild. And it had a lot of things in it that made you realize that it had once been a yard, a mown yard. And so there were 3 cherry trees in the back field. So you'd walk out in this sea of grass, tall grass, and there were these 3 cherry trees. Now, as kids, a cherry tree, is a very easy tree to climb. It's a small tree, and the branches aren't very big. And so they were trees that we climbed at a young age. The sap was very sticky, and the ants loved it. There were always ants in there. But the cherries in these cherry trees tasted terrible. And I remember telling my mom, "Why do we have these cherry trees? These cherries taste terrible." She said, "You're not supposed to eat them off the tree. These are baking cherries." We're like, "Well, what does that mean?" She's like, "Well, here, go gather a bunch." And so she would bake pies. And so the cherries, you were supposed to put them in a pie with, whatever ingredients. And so the pies were pretty good. But you just didn't eat the cherries wild off the tree, I guess. We also had something else that we would make into pies. We had rhubarb that would grow in the back field. Now, for those who don't know what rhubarb looks like, it looks like this. And it's this red stuff that, in the old days, I guess, they would make it into pies. And we did. What else did we have in the back field? We had tiger lilies. There was a whole patch. You could tell it had been someone's garden at one time. But now they just grew wild. So tiger lilies, and then there were lilac bushes. The lilac bushes were beautiful. They came in white and pink and lavender. they were magnificent. We would often take pictures in front of them. So that if there was an event, like a family event, you'd go stand in front of the lilac bush and take pictures. There were also raspberry bushes, tons and tons of raspberry bushes. It was like a whole section of the yard was just raspberry bushes. And the raspberry bushes kind of defined the line between the yard and the forest. So at the edge of the yard, you had raspberry bushes and then the forest. And we would just go out and we would just eat them, just wild. We would just eat the raspberries. And sometimes we would go out with baskets and we would gather up raspberries. And there were always way, way more raspberries than we could do anything with. And, you know, we could bake with them or make pies out of them, but often we just ate them. And there were other bushes. Bushes that I think they were made of vines or who knows what they were, but they were like caves. They formed these natural caves. And I think it was in combination with other types of plants that did that. But when we were young, you know, you had these natural caves made of bushes. When we were small children, that was where we played. That was our playhouse. We played in there. It was cool. So there was also something that my mother called the bamboo. Now, I recently learned that it was actually something called Japanese knotweed, but it looked like bamboo, and my mom called it the bamboo, and that's just what we called it. We didn't know what it was. It was the bamboo. And it grew by the creek, and it didn't go into the forest, and I don't know why, because now that I know that Japanese knotweed grows like crazy, I had to think back and go, well, it didn't really do that, but that's what it was. And I think the reason that it didn't go crazy was that the forest itself had this thick, heavy canopy overhead, and it had this network of roots under the ground. So the knotweed couldn't spread its roots, and it wasn't getting any sunlight in the forest. It only grew over by the creek and over by the edge of the forest. So on the edge of the forest, where it was getting sunlight and it had room to spread its roots, that's where it would grow. But one of my chores was I had to cut down the bamboo. So, you know, do the dishes, take out the trash, cut down the bamboo. So I would go out there with this scythe. It was this thing, I don't know what it was actually called, but it was this thing that we used for mowing the yard without a motor. You'd swing it like a golf club, and I guess this is what people used to cut the grass 100 years ago or 200 years ago, and we had one, and that's how I used it. And I used it, and I would swing like a golf swing, and I would take out a dozen of these bamboo with one swing. And that was what I did to cut these down. One of the things that we did know about this bamboo, or really about the yard in general, we knew that right before my family owned the property, it was owned by a local university. Now, this would have been in the early 20th century, so a long time ago. And we suspect that the bamboo was brought in around then because that's when people imported it. And that's the time period when people thought of it as a decorative plant and not this dangerous invasive weed like we do today. So during that time, you know, before World War II, way, way back, somebody would have planted this thing. But there was another thing about this previous owner that was this university. They had used the property as an experimental farm. And we know that. So who knows what they were planting? Now, it was the turn of the century, so it couldn't have been too weird, but obviously they brought in some things from other places. So we would notice that in the part of the yard where we would cut the grass, if we didn't mow often enough, we would see all kinds of miscellaneous, unknown things growing. Weird, wild stuff. Bizarre things that we couldn't find in any of our plant books, probably because they were imported. But we used to joke about it. It became kind of a running joke that they had done experiments and, it was all kinds of bizarre, crazy stuff. For example, one of the things that grew, if we didn't mow the grass, we would see marijuana growing in the yard, just like the grass, just growing right there. And I didn't know, a small child, I didn't know what it was. My older brothers, who of course were hippies during the hippie era, they thought it was hilarious. And they were always going, "Oh, look at what's growing, ah, ha, ha." And I'd be like, what are you talking about? It's a plant. I don't know anything about that. And they thought it was funny. In our yard, the whole field and the forest and everything, we had a lot of wildlife. There were rabbits and foxes and skunks and mice and voles. And there was this huge brush pile, which I guess went back centuries, probably through many owners. This brush pile was bigger than the garage. It was like a hill. It was shaped like an old-style haystack, like this dome. And there were all these animal paths, like little grass tunnels, leading up to it on every side. And some of these paths were bigger than others, so you could tell some were for mice and some were for maybe foxes. And so the whole huge brush pile was like one big animal apartment building. There was one animal that we saw more often than any other: woodchucks. The back field was riddled with woodchuck holes. Their tunnels were everywhere, in everything. So, for example, they dug holes into the dirt floor of the garage and would chew on anything in there that was made of wood. And of course, most of the things in there were made of wood, so they would chew on it. And then there was a hole in the basement, in the wall of the basement. This huge hole had been made by the woodchucks, so that when you were in the basement, you look over to the side and there's the wall, and there's this huge hole in the wall, in the center of the wall. It just led deep into the darkness, and it was a woodchuck home. And we would often see them in the yard, in the part of the yard that we would mow. And they would come out to graze in the yard, and they were there just so often. My sister and I would try to befriend them, but they were so used to us that they didn't seem particularly bothered by our presence. Now, if we tried to run over to them or pick them up or something, then they'd run away. But if we would just sit down quietly and just sit still, like read a book or just be quiet, then they would just kind of tune us out, just ignore us and come out and graze and do the thing and be fine. And we'd all just kind of sit peacefully together. We couldn't ever pet them. We always wanted to, but we couldn't actually pet them or pick them up. But we coexisted with them. And I remember that we'd sometimes see deer in the field. There was one morning when I looked out my back window. It was around sunrise, and I saw a family of deer just waking up in the early morning. And there was dew, it was mist, and fog, and the deer were gradually waking up, and it was really beautiful. It was really cool. Down the street from us, there was a horse farm. It was also an old house like ours. It was not as old as ours. Ours was probably twice as old. So theirs probably only went back to the turn of the century. But it was a house that had been there, and there was a time when that would have been the only houses, the mansion and our house and the horse farm and the barn. And so my sister and I would often walk over there with carrots or apples, and we would feed the horses and we'd pet them. Now, also in our yard, there was an old rock pile. Someone years ago, long ago, had made a pile of rocks. They weren't necessarily big. They were all different sizes, I guess, but mostly small. And someone had made this pile of rocks a long time ago, and over time it had gradually become half buried with dirt, and grass had grown up around it, so that if you looked there, you didn't see a pile of rocks, you just saw the yard. And this rock pile, this old, once had been a rock pile, was inhabited by a colony of honeybees. So the honeybees had made this their hive. And we would often see them coming and going. But in general, we left them alone. They left us alone. We didn't really mess with them. But in addition to the honeybees, there were wasps. Now the wasps, that was a different story. The wasps had made their home in the walls of our house. So they would often get into the house. Sometimes I would find them in my bedroom. I remember one night, middle of the night, getting stung by one in my bed. I'm sleeping, and I roll over, and ouch, what is that? I thought it was a thumbtack that had fallen from the wall, but it was not. It was a wasp. And that happened pretty regularly. So we just had to deal with it. It wouldn't matter. We'd try to get in there with sprays and whatever. It didn't ever do anything. So yes, wasps were just a part of life in that old house. We also had a lot of snakes. Corn snakes and garter snakes. I remember one time we're in the kitchen, my mom and I are in the kitchen, and my sister walks through the room. She's going through on her way somewhere, and she passes through the room, and she just walks past the dining room table. She points to the floor, and she goes, "Snake," and she just kept going. And we looked under the table. Sure enough, there's a huge corn snake just curled up under the kitchen table, just chilling. So, of course, I had to catch it and take it outside, which, I did. In the backyard, there had been a water pump because, of course, years ago, that's how people would have gotten their water. And we didn't use it anymore, so we had covered it up with a metal plate. So it was just this rectangular sort of a pit, I guess, that we just covered. We didn't have the pit attached to anything, or didn't have the metal plate attached to anything. We would just lift it up and we could look in, and went down like 2 or 3 feet down, and that was it. Well, one year, the garter snakes decided to use that space as a hibernaculum. Now, if you don't know what a hibernaculum is, this is where snakes will go to spend the winter and hibernate. And so that year, the snakes had decided to hibernate in there. And so in the spring, early spring, my sister and I lifted up the lid, like we often did, to look in there. And here are hundreds and hundreds of snakes. So from then on, my sister and I called that the snake pit. Even though, of course, the snakes didn't use it again after that. But it was always, from then on, the snake pit. All right, well, I think that's it for this video. Thank you, and bye.